But my father came from a Kenyan family that includes generations of Muslims. As the Holy Quran tells us, the Holy Quran teaches that, the Holy Quran tells us, and the Holy Quran also says,
just be me or one or two others. We will go over to the side.
Wow. Forgive us the woo! It's overwhelmed.
얼마 전 저희 브래드 TV 방송에서는 마지막 때 적그리스도와 관련된 강의 영상이 방송이 된 적이 있었습니다. 그동안 우리가 일반적으로 알기로는 적그리스도 하면은 유럽 연합에서 나온다 또는 로마 교황청의 교황이다 이런 이야기들을 많이 했었는데 이번 강의에서는 적그리스도는 바로 무슬림 출신일 것이다, 이슬람권에서 나올 것이다 이런 내용으로 강의를 하시면서 우리 브래드 TV 시청자들에게 많은 관심과 또 시청률을 올려주신 분이 계십니다. 바로 조엘 리차드슨이라는 분이신데요. 그분이 쓴 책이 바로 제가 읽었던 책입니다. 바로 이슬람이 안티크라이스트, 이 책을 쓰신 분. 강의 내용도 굉장히 저희한테는 생소하면서 또 충격이었지만 도대체 어떤 더 깊은 내용이 있을지 본인을 직접 만나서 좀 인터뷰를 좀 하고 싶었습니다. 그래서 제가 오늘은 조엘 리차드슨을 찾아서 여기까지 또 찾아왔습니다. Hi, nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you, Brad.
우선 한국의 우리 브래드 TV 시청자들에게 본인 소개와 인사를 좀 해주시죠.
Well, first of all, let me just say hello to South Korea, to the Korean viewers. It's a blessing and honor to be able to just share with you, and I have a great affinity for the work that the Lord is doing among the Korean believers, among the Korean church, not only in Korea, but globally. As I travel throughout the Middle East, everywhere I go, I see Korean, I run into and meet Korean missionaries, and so I'm gratefully indebted to the Korean church.
자, 그러면은 어떻게 해서 이렇게 우리 조엘 씨는 이슬람과 무슬림 그리고 무슬림 속에서 적그리스도 이런 거에 대해서 연구를 하시게 됐는지 우선 그 얘기부터 좀 해주시죠.
I've been involved in reaching out to Muslims since the early 90s, and it was after several years of interfaith dialogue, I'll say evangelism to Muslims, primarily through email dialogue. So the largest online resource it's really a collaboration of Christian missionaries and workers that are reaching out to Muslims. It's called answeringislam.org, and it's translated into several different languages. Well, after several years of working for Answering Islam, doing email correspondence, it was during this whole time, 9/11 unfolded, and what we started seeing after 9/11 was a lot of Western Americans, Europeans converting to Islam. And so this was definitely a bit of a wake-up call. And so in my history of reaching out to Muslims, I had always categorized Islam as sort of just another false religion. To me, you had Hinduism, you had Buddhism, you had Islam. I just thought these are just various false world religions, But it was during this time, as I was dealing with Americans, some of them even Christians, having been raised in a church, that were converting to Islam or in the process of converting to Islam. And I was in dialogue with them via email, giving all of the right answers, and many of them were nevertheless slipping through our hands and converting to Islam. It was during that time that I started to really discern that Islam, it's more than just another false religion. There really is a profoundly seductive spirit behind Islam. And it was during this time that I was also deeply involved in studying and working through Islamic eschatology. What does Islam teach about the end times, the end of the age, the return of Jesus, and all of these things? And so in 2003, 2004, I wrote the book Islamic Antichrist. I actually self-published it, and then it was later republished. And so this is really what I've become most known for, sort of my introduction into public ministry as an author, as Joel Richardson. And Joel Richardson is actually a pseudonym because really anyone who is writing nowadays, with technology, anyone who is writing critically of Islam and who wants to serve in any way as a missionary, or just for security purposes, most often is using some form of pseudonym. And this is the nature of the world that we live in. And so often you hear stories of missionaries who's, they're compromised. They speak at a church and they say, please don't put our name on the internet, but then it's on the bulletin, and next thing you know, they're getting kicked out of the country. So I've been using a pseudonym for many years now, but in a lot of ways, Joel Richardson is I'm as used to it as my real name. But so yeah, the author of Islamic Antichrist, and then I've written a few books since then. And then over the past decade, I've really just been traveling globally, awakening the church to the central role of Islam in the last days, awakening the church to the urgency of the hour with regard to the return of Jesus, trying to approach all of these things in a very balanced, gospel-centered way, and again, just awakening the church to the urgency of the hour.
주열 씨는 이슬람, 무슬림에 대해서 이렇게 집중적으로 연구를 하시다 보니까 그 무슬림들한테도 좀 뭐라 해야 되나, 공격을 받는다든가 협박을 받는다든가 이런다는 이야기를 들었어요. 그래서 그 주열 씨하고 이렇게 사실은 연락하기가 굉장히 쉽지 않을 정도로 본인의 어떤 그 위치나 이런 신상에 대해서 이렇게 외부에 잘 노출시키지 않는다고 제가 이야기를 들었거든요. 실제로 그렇습니까?
Well, in light of where technology has gone over the past 10 years, missions and security, we're living in a new world. And so for anyone who is engaged in reaching Muslims and writing critically of Islam, which I am, I'm critical of the religion of Islam. I love Muslims, and I encourage Christians to love Muslims as Christ loves Muslims, as God loves Muslims. But clearly, I think anybody who is paying attention knows that Islam has in its foundations a lot of violence, and unfortunately that affects a percentage of Muslims. And so, yeah, security is definitely an issue, and I use a pseudonym, which allows me to travel throughout the Middle East and some restricted nations. And I find that a lot of missionaries today are using some form of pseudonym for security purposes. And ultimately, as I travel and so forth, I'm not living in fear. You see, there's wisdom and there's fear, and I don't believe in functioning in fear. On the other hand, it's wise to try to protect your family and your address and this sort of thing. So it's a fairly thin firewall that I function under, but I do try to utilize some level of security and wisdom.
어쨌든 그런 속에서도 저희하고 이렇게 인터뷰를 응해 주셔서 너무 감사드리고요. 이제부터 본격적으로 이 이슬람과 또 적그리스도에 대해서 이야기를 좀 들어볼 텐데요. 우선 이슬람에 대해서 좀 여쭤보겠습니다. 지금 IS의 만행으로 인해서 전 세계 사람들이 사실은 이제 공포에 떨고 있고, 또 이슬람의 세력이 점점 확장되면서 무슬림의 숫자가 전체적으로 늘어나고 있는데, 미국에서도 굉장히 이 무슬림의 숫자가 늘어나고 있죠. 어느 정도 늘어나고 있습니까?
I'm not sure of the exact percentage, and the figures vary quite a bit between when you get sort of official figures versus what the Muslim community always tries to make it sound bigger than it is. But there's no question with the global Syrian refugee crisis, with the various crises that are unfolding across the earth, the refugee situation. President Obama is welcoming in quite a bit more Muslim refugees. And of course, Muslims tend to have children far more than your average American. And so their birth rates are significantly higher. So they project that I believe within about a decade there'll be more Muslims, for instance, than there are Jews. So I think the number will be around 7 or 8 million. Mind you, there are roughly 300 and I want to say about 20 or 30 million in the United States altogether. So it's still small. The United States is behind Europe 25, 30 years, but it's definitely growing.
그럼 그 속도가 앞으로 계속 더 늘어날까요?
Well, it definitely is increasing. And you know, there's one factor here that's worth mentioning is that one of the most significant places where Islam is growing is in the prisons. It's in the American prison system. And this is not just in the United States, it's actually all over the world. And unfortunately, just because of our broken system, both socially and the prison system itself, the number of African Americans in prison is exponentially higher. And so Islam is really impacting the African American community far more than the larger American population. And so a lot of the growth of Islam is taking place in the urban core, more in the inner cities. And African American pastors are really having to deal with this transformation of the African American community over the past 30, 40 years. But it's, you know, in many parts, you go to Washington, D.C., even among these young 12, 13, 14-year-old kids, it's very hip and trendy. It's popular to say, oh, well, I'm a Muslim. And they identify with Islam as if it's part of this sort of rejection of the system. And so there's a very bad merging of various trends all at the same time.
미국의 이 무슬림의 숫자가 늘어나는 것이 무슬림이 미국의 시민권자로 유입되는 경우도 있겠지만 또 미국에 살고 있던 크리스찬이 개종을 해서 무슬림으로 바뀌는 경우도 많이 생기고 있죠.
You know, it's amazing because I mentioned the high number of conversions in the prisons, the high number of conversions in the African American community, but there's actually many Christians that actually have converted to Islam. And I find personally there's a social underlying issue, and I'll explain it this way, is that in Western culture, we have been brainwashed with multiculturalism and moral relativity. And we've been essentially told that we should be ashamed of American culture and sort of who we are. And so Westerners, as a rule, are very culturally passive. And this includes our confidence levels in even Christianity, whereas Muslims are incredibly confident in their religion. And so I find that in the realm of evangelism, the people that are most successful are those that are most confident in what they are selling, what they are representing. And often the Muslim evangelists are far more aggressive, far more confident, and they're coming up to a people who have been hamstrung. We've been brainwashed to be ashamed, to be far more open to various cultures. And to a degree, that's good. But I would say that Americans and Christians in general, we need to reclaim confidence in the message that we have. The message that we have is so superior, intellectually, religiously, spiritually, emotionally, in every way. Historically, I mean, just in terms of factually, it's superior. But a lot of American Christians have lost their zeal, that we've lost our evangelistic fervor. And, that's just one reason. There's so many reasons why people actually convert to Islam. The way, and I'll say it this way too, the way that Islam is often represented in Western countries, or even in Korea, is they present Islam as sort of a more authentic version of Christianity. It's more of a Middle Eastern, slightly more exotic version of what we believe. It's almost, they present it as more biblical than Christianity. And, they'll highlight let's say, the lack of modesty among dress, and they'll really exploit the weaknesses of the church and say, oh, but we, look in the Bible, they wore head coverings, we're more biblical than you, and they kind of use these type of arguments. But the Christianity that they present at the front end, I call it a Christianized version of Islam, or you could say a decaffeinated version of Islam, Islam light. However, once they convert to Islam, once they become Muslims, then they discover the true Islam, which is a very violent, a very intolerant, a very often racist and misogynistic faith system. And so a high number of the converts in the West to Islam, it's actually 70% are women. So you can see how Satan exploits relationships to lead people to convert to Islam. But the divorce rate among women that convert to Islam because of marriage is actually 70%. So, many of these women that convert to Islam because of marriage later end up leaving Islam after the marriage dissolves. So there is a little bit of a revolving door, and we need to acknowledge that factor in as well.
기본적으로 미국 사회는 기독교 신앙을 바탕으로 한 그런 사회 구조로 알고 있는데, 이렇게 이제 무슬림의 세력이 점점 많아지게 되면은 이 미국 사회 안에서 결국은 이 기독교 문명과 이슬람 문명의 또 다른 충돌이 일어나지 않을까, 그게 사실은 좀 걱정이 돼요.
One of the greatest warnings that Jesus gave with regard to the last days is he says, in the last days, the love of most, in the English, some translations say the love of most, some say many, will grow cold. And so when I look at that verse and I look at what's unfolding right now in sort of the clash between Islam and Western culture, I see a divine test. I think the Lord is actually allowing the church to be tested, because as radical Islam is exploding across the earth, as we see the beheadings, we see what ISIS is doing in the Middle East, the natural response is that those in the West are fearful. And fear is a fairly normal response. However, it's a carnal response. I mean, it's not, the Lord's not afraid, and the Lord doesn't want his people to be afraid. And so what happens is, out of fear often comes racism and prejudice. And so while you do have this number, a percentage of Muslims, and it's hard to know exactly which percentage are actually violent, who want to take over the country, or who actually want to utilize violence and kill people for the purpose of furthering Islam, it's still just a smaller percentage. So you have a high percentage of Muslims that are, I guess I'll say, liberal. They're not really reading the Quran, they're culturally Muslim. But then you have this wave of hatred and racism. And so it begins to sort of foment this clash. And it's at moments like this in history that then you have often sort of extreme right-wing reactions. And this is where you get some of the movements that are rising up in Europe right now, and they end up electing, radical sort of racist movements. And, whether they're extreme right-wing or left-wing is debatable. But as the human heart responds in a carnal manner, that foments the clash. And I believe the church is called to rise above that we're called to be wise as serpents but gentle as doves. We are not naive. I'm not naive regarding Islam. I wrote a book called Islamic Antichrist. I understand that Islam is a great threat. However, I also know that our primary mandate as followers of Jesus is to reach Muslims, is to love Muslims, is to love our enemies. And right now is a moment in history when we have the opportunity to love our enemies. And I see many in the church that are allowing the carnal spirit of the age to lay hold of them and lay hold of their hearts. And so it's a difficult moment. We need to approach these events with wisdom. We need to be aware of the threat and the danger of Islam, but we need to approach it in a Christ-like manner.
미국 사회에서 이렇게 무슬림의 그 숫자가 늘어난 이유 중에 하나가 오바마 정부의 역할도 좀 큰 것 같아요. 만약에 오바마 정부가 바뀌고 다른 정부가 들어서면 좀 상황이 달라질까요?
I have a good friend that was in the Department of Homeland Security, And so I've sat down and talked to him personally. And so what I'm about to say is not conspiracy theory. It's not just anti-Obama conspiracy theory. But he was fairly high up in the Department of Homeland Security, and he would write up reports on various Muslims that had come into the country. And part of the theology of Islam, if you want to engage in jihad, you have to make a sort of statement of intent and post it publicly. It's just part of Islamic law. And so there were various Muslims that had come into the country, and they would post this on some obscure Arabic website, right? So the U.S. government most often wouldn't be aware of it. Well, this, my friend's job was to find this information, to, scour the internet. And so he had written up a report on about a dozen different Muslims that were here in the United States who had openly stated online that their desire was to replace the U.S. government with Islamic government, that their intention was to carry out jihad in the United States. Well, a couple years passed, we're into the Obama administration, and his superiors sent him the message to sanitize these reports, to go into these reports and take out this information. And then later, a dozen or so individuals were actually promoted into positions of in the U.S. government. And so there's no question that, unfortunately, President Obama made it a very specific policy decision to bring into the U.S. government Muslims that he believed, well, I don't know what he believed. He would probably say, he was looking for moderate Muslims, but he wanted to bring Muslims into the U.S. government. And so the past several years with Obama as president, he has transformed the government, and that's affected policy. That's affected American foreign policy. It's affected a lot of things. And so there's now actually a governmental bias in certain sectors of the U.S. government that have promoted this minority population to having a far more substantial influence in this country than they actually merit by their numbers. And the influence, the impact of President Obama and his foreign policy, the impact of President Obama coming into office and his transition into a different approach, it hasn't just impacted the United States, it's impacted the world. Because not only did President Obama say, we're going to bring Muslims into the U.S. government, there was a very deliberate transition of American foreign policy throughout the Middle East. So previously, under different administrations, we've been propping up these various dictators, these third-rate dictators, whether it's Mubarak or Gaddafi or Assad or Saddam Hussein. And so obviously under Bush, we took out Saddam Hussein. Well, under Obama, he said, from now on, we're not going to support these various autocrats, these dictators. We're going to shift and begin bringing in a more, that he would say, a moderate form of Islamist government. So he looked to Turkey, the nation of Turkey, and he said, we're going to try to replicate the Turkish model throughout the Middle East. And so, a lot of people thought, oh, well, President Obama is going to be a dove. He's not going to be the hawk, beating the drums of war like Bush. But when Obama came in, look at what's happened. We overthrew Mubarak, who was a long-term American ally. Now, he may have been a bit of a dictator, but he maintained stability in Egypt. And then through the Obama administration, we saw Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood come into power. As a result of American intervention in Libya, we saw Muammar Gaddafi, again a dictator, we saw him murdered in the streets. That was directly the result of President Obama's foreign policy transition. And now look at Libya. It's practically half of it's occupied by ISIS. ISIS, the whole transition of multiple nations throughout the Middle East is a direct result of the foreign policy decisions of President Obama.
지금 이렇게 미국 사회에 무슬림 세력이 늘어나고 전 세계에 이렇게 이슬람의 숫자가 늘어나면서 IS가 특세를 하고 이런 것들이 결국은 이슬람 종교의 종말론과 서로 이렇게 연결되어 있는 겁니다.
And it's very similar to the biblical story in just a very general sense of what happens in the last days with the Antichrist and the false prophet and the return of Jesus, except they've flipped the whole story on its head.
이슬람에는 그 시아파가 있고 수니파가 있죠. 시아파, 수니파 똑같은 개념으로 그렇게 종말론을 받아들이는 겁니다.
There are some minor differences. The most significant difference is they all believe in the coming of a Messiah figure that they call the Mehdi. In English, you could just say the Mahdi. And he is this Messiah figure that comes at the end of the age, and he will cause Islam to be superior throughout the world.
Today is Israel's future according to Bible prophecy. Shall be able. We can't know the future, yet Daniel 12:10 tells us, none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall be able to understand. So Almighty God said, in the days when Great Britain and Russia are powers in the earth, I am coming to the world to put down the thrones of men and to establish my kingdom. How astounding is this? That in 550 BC, Almighty God prophesied the United States of America and where we would come from. I mean, we're talking about 2,300 years in advance. It appears the scriptures tell us, as well as Yossi Balin earlier in 2013 told us, that this will be an interim agreement. As a matter of fact, Balin quoted Netanyahu as saying that he would okay a provisional Palestinian state. So what will be the provisions of this interim agreement? First thing, it will turn the West Bank, which is biblical Judea, Samaria, over to the Palestinians as soon as the agreement is consummated. Furthermore, the Temple Mount is a source of tremendous conflict. That 37 acres, that is the most disputed 37 acres on the planet. Right now, the Muslims worship there. They have the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But this is the holiest place to the Jewish people. This is where their first temple stood, their second temple stood. And so there's a lot of strife over it right now. Well, this agreement is going to put this under a sharing arrangement. Both Muslims and Jews will be able to worship there, and it will be under international supervision.